The winter of 1982. The Kamchatka Peninsula. The silence here is a physical weight. It is a landscape defined by the brutal indifference of nature, a sprawling expanse of white emptiness that stretches from the jagged coastlines of the Pacific deep into the frozen heart of Siberia. At 30,000 feet, the air is thin, lethal, and deceptively calm. Below, the Soviet Union maintains its iron grip on the eastern frontier, a fortress of radar stations, surface-to-air missile batteries, and air bases carved out of the permafrost. This is the edge of the world. This is where the Soviet Union ends, and the unknown begins. Inside the hardened concrete bunker of a P-14 Tall King radar station, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale tobacco smoke and the hum of high-voltage vacuum tubes. The station was one of dozens forming the early warning chain, the eyes of the Kremlin looking out toward the hostile expanse of the Pacific Ocean. For the operators hunched over the circular scopes, the job was hours of crushing boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. They were trained to look for the signature of American bombers, the B-52 Stratofortress aircraft that prowled the periphery or the terrifying arc of an inbound ballistic missile. But on this particular night, the scope showed something that did not make sense. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, not the defector, but a loyal radar officer of the same common name, stared at the phosphorus green sweep of the display. The rhythmic arm of the radar swept around, painting the terrain, the static, and the clutter of the atmosphere. And then, a blip. It appeared at the very edge of the detection envelope, ghosting in from the south. It was faint, flickering in and out of existence like a phantom. Belenko frowned, adjusting the gain on his console, his fingers working the Bakelite dials with practiced ease. He expected the signal to resolve into a standard commercial airliner off course, or perhaps a weather anomaly. The radar arm swept again. The blip had moved. Belenko froze. His eyes narrowed, his mind racing to calculate the distance covered between the two sweeps. The math didn't add up. He grabbed a grease pencil and marked the position on the glass screen. He waited for the next sweep. Sweep. The new position was impossibly far from the first. "Comrade Captain," Belenko called out, his voice cracking slightly. "I have a contact. Sector 4 to 7. Altitude. Altitude is indeterminate. It is flickering above the ceiling." The shift commander, a weary veteran of the Korean War, walked over, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. He peered over Belenko's shoulder, cigarette smoke trailing from his lips. "System error," he grunted. "Check your calibration. Nothing flies that fast." "I have checked, comrade." "The system is green. Then it is a glitch. A ghost echo from the ionosphere. Ignore it." But Belenko couldn't ignore it. The blip was steady now, and it was carving a straight line directly parallel to the sovereign airspace of the USSR. It was moving with a purpose. It was moving with an arrogance that chilled the blood. Belenko did the mental arithmetic again. The object was covering ground at a speed that defied the laws of aerodynamics as understood by the Soviet military manuals. It was traveling at over 3,000 kilometers per hour. "Captain," Belenko whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Speed is Mach 3+. It is not a glitch. It is solid." The captain snatched the headset from the console, listening to the raw feed from the antenna. The sound was a high-pitched whine, a distinct electronic signature that did not belong to nature. The cigarette fell from his mouth. "Sound the alarm." The bunker erupted into chaos. The klaxon wailed, a harsh, mechanical scream that shattered the stillness of the Siberian night. If you want to uncover the deep technical secrets and hidden histories of the Cold War's most intense technological battles, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We dig into the declassified files to bring you the truth behind the legends. On the tarmac of the nearby Petropavlovsk Air Base, the alarm spurred a frantic ballet of men and machines. Ground crews in thick fur-lined parkas scrambled over the icy concrete, pulling chocks and ripping covers off the intakes of the Interceptors. These were not just any aircraft. They were MiG-25 Foxbat aircraft, the fastest, most powerful interceptors the Soviet Union had ever built. They were massive, twin-engine beasts designed for one specific purpose: to sprint into the stratosphere and kill American bombers before they could launch their nuclear payloads. Inside the cockpit of lead Foxbat 0-4, Major Yuri Volkov strapped himself in. His breath misted in the freezing air of the unpressurized cockpit. He could feel the vibration of the massive Tumansky turbojets spooling up behind him, a raw power that shook the entire airframe. Volkov was an elite pilot. He knew the capabilities of his machine. He knew it could touch Mach 2.8, maybe Mach 3.2 if he was willing to wreck the engines. He carried 4 R-40 missiles, weapons the size of telephone poles, designed to blow a bomber out of the sky from 40 kilometers away. 04 Tower, Vector 190. Target is high and fast. Intercept and identify. Weapons free if they cross the line. Copy Tower, 04 rolling. Volkov slammed the throttles forward. The afterburners ignited with a concussive roar, 2 blue-white flames tearing through the darkness. The MiG-25 aircraft surged down the runway, heavy with fuel and missiles, lifting off into the black sky. Volkov pulled the stick back, putting the Interceptor into a steep climb. The G-forces slammed him into his seat, his G-suit inflating to keep the blood in his brain. He watched the altimeter spin. 10,000 meters, 15,000, 20,000. He was entering the domain of the gods. The sky turned from black to a deep, bruised purple. The curvature of the earth became visible. Tower, 0 to 4. I am at 22,000 meters. Where is the target? Target is 12 o'clock high. Range 80 kilometers. Speed, constant. Volkov checked his radar screen. The massive Smerch radar in the nose of the Foxbat, capable of burning through the strongest jamming, began to sweep the void ahead. There, a faint return. A ghost. Volkov pushed the throttles past the detent, engaging the emergency power setting. The engines screamed, consuming fuel at a rate that would drain his tanks in minutes. The MiG-25 aircraft shuddered, pushing against the thick shock waves of air that built up on its nose. He was doing Mach 2.5. He was faster than a rifle bullet. And yet, the target was pulling away. It was impossible. Volkov stared at the scope in disbelief. He was flying the fastest interceptor in the world. He was pushing it to the very limit of structural failure. The temperature warning lights on his dashboard began to flicker. The friction of the air was heating the steel skin of his aircraft to critical levels. Tower! I cannot close. Target is accelerating. Maintain pursuit 04. We have a solution for SAM batteries. Below him, on the frozen tundra, the SA-5 Gammon missile batteries were rotating their massive radars. They tracked the intruder. They locked on. Volkov watched as the target blip seemed to taunt him. It wasn't maneuvering. It wasn't evading. It was simply existing in a realm of performance that made his state-of-the-art interceptor look like a biplane. Launch, 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 the radio crackled. From the ground, 3 missiles streaked upward, riding pillars of fire into the stratosphere. They were designed to kill high-altitude targets. They were fast, Mach 4 monsters. Volkov banked hard to avoid the debris field, watching the missiles climb. They tracked the target. They closed the distance. The geometry was perfect. The intruder had flown into a trap. It was doomed. There was no aircraft in the world that could outrun an SA-5 once it had a lock. And then, the impossible happened. The target on the radar screen didn't jink. It didn't drop countermeasures. It simply accelerated. The blip jumped forward. The missiles, programmed to anticipate a target's trajectory, corrected, but they were correcting for a target moving at standard supersonic speeds. This thing was moving faster than the missiles themselves could effectively track in the thin air. The missiles detonated miles behind the target, harmless puffs of black smoke in the upper atmosphere. Volkov watched the blip fade from his scope as it crossed the horizon, leaving Soviet airspace as easily as a man walking through an open door. He was alone in the stratosphere, his engines overheating, his fuel critical, floating in the silence of his failure. Tower, Volkov said, his voice hollow. Target lost. Repeat, target lost. Back in the bunker, Lieutenant Belenko stared at the empty screen. The room was silent. The shift commander stood frozen, the unlit cigarette hanging from his lip. They had thrown everything they had at it. The best interceptors, the most advanced missiles, the element of surprise, and the intruder hadn't even bothered to turn. This wasn't just a violation of airspace. It was a demonstration, a message written in shockwaves across the Siberian sky. The shift commander finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. What was that? Belenko shook his head. I do not know, Comrade Captain, but whatever it is, we cannot stop it. The stakes had just changed. For decades, the Soviet Union had relied on the certainty that their airspace was a fortress. They believed that if the Americans ever came, it would be a brutal fight, but a fight the Soviets could win. They had built a wall of missiles and steel to ensure it. But tonight, something had flown over that wall. Something that treated their deadliest weapons with total indifference. If the Americans had a bomber that could fly this fast, this high, and this fearlessly, then the entire Soviet air defense network, trillions of rubles, millions of man-hours, the pride of the motherland, was obsolete. They were naked. "Secure the tapes," the commander ordered, snapping out of his daze. "Get me the secure line to Moscow. The general staff needs to know." "Know what, sir?" Belenko asked. "What do we tell them?" "Tell them," the commander said, staring at the blank radar screen, "that we are no longer safe." This was the beginning of the obsession. This was the spark that would ignite a frantic, paranoid hunt for a ghost. The Soviets didn't know it yet, but they had just met the Archangel, and the realization of what they were up against would drive them to the brink of technological madness. They had to find out what it was. They had to find a way to kill it. Because if they couldn't, the Cold War was already lost. The report from Kamchatka did not stay in the frozen bunker. It traveled through the nervous system of the Soviet military apparatus, moving from the regional command in Khabarovsk, across the endless steppes, and finally landing on a heavy mahogany desk in Moscow. It was stamped top secret and state importance. It joined a growing stack of similar files, a collection of anomalies that had been keeping the generals of the PVO Streny, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, awake at night. General Pyotr Kirsanov, a man whose chest was heavy with medals from the Great Patriotic War, stared at the file. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the high ceiling of his office within the Ministry of Defense. Outside, the grey Moscow sky was weeping freezing rain, but inside, the air was stifling. "Another one," Kirsanov muttered. "Same profile, same speed, same result." Across the desk sat Colonel Volkov, not the pilot from Kamchatka, but an intelligence officer from the GRU. He looked exhausted. His eyes were rimmed with red, and his uniform was slightly rumpled. He had spent the last 6 months chasing ghosts. "The radar tapes confirm the pilot's account, Comrade General," the colonel said, tapping the file. "The target maintained a velocity of 3,500 kilometers per hour. It held an altitude of 26,000 meters. It did not deviate. It did not maneuver. It simply flew over our defenses as if we were not there." Kirsanov slammed his hand on the desk. "It is an insult. They are spitting in our faces. We have the most advanced air defense network in history. We have rings of steel around our borders. How does a single aircraft make a mockery of the Soviet Union?" This was the heart of the investigation. It wasn't just a technical curiosity, it was an existential crisis. The Soviet Union's entire military doctrine was based on the concept of denial. They could not match the American Navy ship for ship, so they built submarines to sink them. They could not match the American economy dollar for dollar, so they built missiles to level the playing field. But the sky was supposed to be theirs. The investigation was launched with a desperate intensity. It was given the code name Project Zenith. The goal was simple: identify the intruder, understand its capabilities, and find a way to kill it. But the more they looked, the less they understood. The first problem was the radar signature. When the Soviet analysts examined the raw data from the engagement radars, they were baffled. A typical aircraft, even a large bomber like the B-52 Stratofortress, has a distinct radar cross-section. It appears as a solid returns. But this object was different. It blooms, the chief scientist at the TSNI 108 Research Institute explained to the committee weeks later. He pointed to a grainy projection on the wall. "Look here, the signal fluctuates. It expands and contracts. It is organic. It suggests the aircraft is using materials we have never seen, or perhaps electronic jamming of a type we cannot comprehend." The scientists argued that for an aircraft to fly that fast, the friction heat would be intense enough to melt aluminum. The Americans must be using a new alloy. Titanium? Perhaps. But the Soviet Union controlled the world's supply of titanium. If the Americans were building a fleet of titanium aircraft, where were they getting the metal? The KGB was tasked with tracking global titanium shipments. They found nothing suspicious. The Americans were buying huge quantities of ore through shell companies, officially for pizza ovens and golf clubs. The Soviet trade ministers, eager for hard currency, had happily sold it to them. The irony that the motherland itself might have supplied the skin of the intruder was a thought too dark to articulate in the committee meetings. Then there were the pilot reports. They were rare, but they existed. Over the years, the most skilled Soviet aviators had caught fleeting glimpses of the intruder. These accounts were treated like religious sightings, analyzed and dissected for every scrap of detail. One report from 1978, filed by a pilot flying a MiG-23 Interceptor over the Baltic Sea, described a black dart against the stars. It looked like a shadow, the pilot had written in his debrief. It had no markings, no navigation lights. It was long and slender, like a needle. I saw two blue flames from the rear, shock diamonds that stretched for 50 meters. It was beautiful. And it was gone before I could even arm my missiles. Another report from the Kola Peninsula described the object as sinister. The pilot claimed he saw the air shimmering around it, the heat signature so intense it distorted the light. It flies inside a fireball, he claimed. These reports built a legend. In the mess halls of air bases from East Germany to Vladivostok, the pilots whispered about the black ghost. It became a bogeyman. It was the monster that lived in the upper atmosphere, the thing that watched them while they slept. The psychological toll was real. Knowing that the enemy could fly over your head with impunity, snapping photographs of your secret bases, your missile silos, your children playing in the schoolyards, bred a sense of deep paranoia. The Soviet leadership demanded answers. They needed a category. They needed to put this thing in a box so they could destroy it. And this is where the investigation led them to the wrong conclusions. The Soviet mindset was heavily influenced by their own design philosophy. They built brute force machines. If they wanted to go fast, they built a bigger engine. If they wanted to fly high, they built a bigger wing. They assumed the Americans did the same. It is a bomber, General Kirsanov concluded during a high-level strategy session in the Kremlin. It has to be. Look at the size of the radar return when it does appear. Look at the energy it requires. The Americans would not spend billions of dollars to build a hypersonic aircraft just to take pictures. Satellites can take pictures. The logic seemed sound. The Americans had the XB-70 Valkyrie project in the 1960s, a massive supersonic bomber. The Soviets believed that although the Valkyrie was publicly cancelled, the research had gone underground. They were convinced that this black ghost was a nuclear strike platform. They are testing the corridors, Kirsanov argued, tracing a line on the map across the North Pole. They are flying these routes to time our reaction speeds. They are mapping the electronic order of battle. When the war comes, these aircraft will be the first wave. They will fly over the Arctic at Mach 3, drop hydrogen bombs on our command centers, before we can even open the silo doors, and be back in Alaska for breakfast. This conclusion terrified the Politburo. It wasn't just a spy plane, it was a sword of Damocles hanging over Moscow. The panic drove them to irrational lengths. They began to see the ghost everywhere. Every radar glitch, every weather balloon, every meteor was identified as an American intruder. They kept their pilots on Alert 5 status, sitting in their cockpits for hours, waiting for the scramble order. Engines were worn out, nerves were frayed. In their desperation, they tried to adapt their existing technology. They stripped the MiG-25 Foxbat aircraft of all non-essential weight guns, armor, backup radios, trying to squeeze a few hundred more meters of altitude out of the airframe. They developed lofting tactics for their missiles. The tactic was suicidal. A MiG-25 pilot would accelerate to Mach 2.5, pull the nose up into a 45-degree climb, and fire his missiles blindly into the stratosphere, hoping the seeker heads would lock onto the target as they coasted into the thin air. It never worked. The missiles would burn out their fuel, stall in the vacuum, and fall back to Earth. The physics were undeniable. To catch a target moving at Mach 3 at 80,000 feet, you didn't just need a fast plane, you needed a spaceship. But the investigation did yield one chilling realization. The analysts at the GRU began to notice a pattern in the timing of the flights. They know, Colonel Volkov told General Kirsanov one evening months into the investigation. Know what? They know when we are blind. They fly when we are shifting shift rotations. They fly when our radar maintenance cycles are active. They fly when the sun angle blinds our optical trackers. Volkov laid a series of charts on the table. This isn't just speed, Comrade General. This is total information dominance. They are listening to our radio traffic. They know the names of our radar operators. They know when Ivan goes for a smoke break. They are mocking us. Kirsanov stared at the map. The red lines of the intruder's flight paths crisscrossed the motherland like scars. They are not just flying over us, Volkov, the general said, his voice low. They are demonstrating to the world that the Soviet Union is a second-rate power. We claim to control the workers of the world. Yet we cannot control our own sky. The investigation had hit a wall. They knew what was happening, they were being violated. They knew who was doing it, the Americans. But they didn't know how. The technology required to sustain Mach 3 flight for hours was beyond Soviet engineering capability. Their engines melted, their fuel turned to jelly, their hydraulics boiled. How were the Americans doing it? Was it magic? Was it alien technology? The paranoia deepened. Rumors circulated in the Kremlin that the Americans had made a breakthrough in propulsion physics that the Soviet scientists had missed completely. Heads rolled at the design bureaus. Chief designers were fired or sent to the Gulag for sabotage because they couldn't replicate the American performance. The Soviets were looking for a complex, brute force answer to a problem the Americans had solved with elegance and a daring gamble. While the Kremlin fumed and the pilots cursed, the investigation turned inward. If they couldn't catch the plane, they had to catch the spy. Surely there was a leak. Surely someone was telling the Americans where the radar holes were. The KGB launched a massive mole hunt within the PVO Strany, arresting loyal officers, interrogating radar crews, tearing apart the very network they were trying to protect. The Black Ghost was doing more damage to the Soviet military without firing a shot than a squadron of bombers could have done with high explosives. It was causing them to eat themselves alive. And thousands of miles away, in a sun-drenched hangar in California, the men who built the Ghost were preparing for the next mission. They had no idea of the chaos they were causing. To them, it was just physics. To the Soviets, it was witchcraft. While the Kremlin was consuming itself with paranoia, and Soviet generals were chasing ghosts across radar screens in frozen bunkers, the source of their terror was sitting under the bright, unrelenting sun of the Nevada desert. It did not look like a weapon of war. It looked like something that had been grown, not built. It was a long, sleek dagger of midnight blue metal, resting on the tarmac at Groom Lake Area 51. Heat waves shimmered off the runway, distorting the horizon, but the aircraft itself seemed to absorb the light. This was the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird aircraft, and it was the single most audacious engineering project in human history. To understand why the Soviets were so baffled, why they believed they were facing aliens or magic, you have to understand where this machine came from. It was born not in a Pentagon boardroom, but in a windowless office in Burbank, California, known as the Skunk Works. The man in charge was Clarence Kelly Johnson. He was a genius of aerodynamics, a man who didn't use computers to design planes. He used a slide rule and an intuitive understanding of the wind. In the late 1950s, the CIA had come to him with a problem. Their U-2 spy planes, slow-moving gliders that flew high, were becoming vulnerable. The Soviets were developing missiles that could reach them. The United States needed a replacement. They needed a plane that could fly higher than the U-2, but also faster, much faster. They wanted a plane that was untouchable. Johnson accepted the challenge. But the physics of what the CIA asked for were theoretically impossible. To outrun a missile, the plane had to fly at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. At that speed, the air itself becomes a solid wall. Smashing through it creates friction so intense that the leading edges of the wings heat up to over 500 degrees Celsius. The nose cone glows red hot at 300 degrees. Standard aircraft aluminum melts at those temperatures. The plane would simply disintegrate in mid-air. This was the thermal thicket. Every other engineer said it couldn't be crossed. Kelly Johnson decided to build a plane out of the only metal that could survive that hell, titanium. But there was a catch, a massive geopolitical irony that would have made the Soviet generals weep if they had known. In the 1960s, the United States didn't have enough high-grade titanium to build a fleet of aircraft. The only country with abundant titanium reserves was the Soviet Union. So, the CIA set up a complex network of shell companies and dummy corporations. They bought the metal from the Soviets, ostensibly for benign civilian uses. The Soviet government, desperate for foreign currency, happily sold the very ore that would be forged into the sword that would pierce their heart. Every SR-71 Blackbird aircraft that terrified the Kremlin was literally made of Soviet soil. But getting the metal was just the start. Working with titanium was a nightmare. It was brittle. It was stubborn. When the Skunk Works machinists tried to drill it, their tools shattered. They had to invent entirely new tooling manufacturing processes. They found that the chlorine in the local Burbank water supply was corroding the welds, so they had to use distilled water for every wash. The engineering solutions required were so radical they bordered on madness. Consider the fuel. At Mach 3, the fuel tanks inside the wings would heat up to hundreds of degrees. Standard aviation fuel would boil and explode. So, the chemists created JP7. It was a liquid with a high flash point. It was so stable you could throw a lit match into a bucket of it and the match would just go out. It wouldn't burn unless it was injected with a chemical primer called triethylborane, which exploded on contact with air. But the brilliance didn't stop there. Johnson realized he could use this fuel as a coolant. Before the fuel went into the engines, it was pumped through heat exchangers behind the cockpit and through the leading edges of the wings. The freezing cold fuel absorbed the heat from the friction, cooling the airframe, and then was injected into the engines preheated for maximum efficiency. The plane literally used its own speed to survive. Then there was the problem of expansion. When metal gets hot, it expands. At Mach 3, the Blackbird aircraft would grow several inches in length. If the plane was built tight and flush, like a normal jet, the expansion would buckle the skin and rip the wings off. So, Johnson built it loose. He designed the panels with gaps. On the ground, the SR-71 Blackbird aircraft was a leaky, rattling mess. Fuel would seep out of the seams, dripping onto the hangar floor. Ground crews had to put pans underneath it. It looked like a broken piece of junk. But once it took off and hit Mach 3, the friction heated the panels. The metal expanded. The gaps sealed shut. The fuselage became a solid, airtight unit. It was a machine that only made sense at the edge of the impossible. And the engines, the Pratt & Whitney J58 engines. These were monsters. They were the first engines designed to operate continuously in afterburner. Most jets use afterburners for short bursts, dogfighting or takeoff. The Blackbird lived in afterburner. To make this work, the engineers designed a massive, movable spike at the front of the engine inlet. As the plane accelerated, this spike would retract, managing the shockwave of air entering the engine. It converted the Blackbird from a turbojet into a ramjet in mid-flight. The faster it went, the more efficient it became. While the Soviet MiG-25 engines were tearing themselves apart to reach Mach 2.8 for a few minutes, the SR-71 engines were just warming up. They could cruise at Mach 3.2 for hours, purring like a kitten. But the machine was nothing without the men. The pilots chosen for this program were the elite of the elite. They were not just aviators, they were astronauts. Because the Blackbird flew at 85,000 feet, the very edge of space, the pilots had to wear fully pressurized gold-visored spacesuits. If the cockpit depressurized at that altitude, their blood would boil instantly. One of these pilots was Major Brian Schul. He understood the soul of the machine. He knew that flying the sled, as they called it, was an exercise in precision. A typical mission profile was a logistical ballet. The Blackbird would take off from a base in Okinawa or England with only a partial fuel load to save weight and stress on the tires. It would rendezvous with a KC-135 tanker immediately, gulping down 80,000 pounds of JP7. Then, the pilot would turn the nose toward the target. Dip the nose, the checklist said. Accelerate. The climb was a religious experience. The sky would darken. The stars would come out in the middle of the day. The curve of the earth would reveal itself, a blue marble against the void. Inside the cockpit, it was quiet. The roar of the engines was left far behind, traveling slower than the plane itself. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of the pilot in the suit and the hum of the avionics. While the Soviet radar operators below were screaming, while the klaxons were wailing in the bunkers, and while the MiG pilots were sweating in their cockpits trying to get a lock, the American pilot was sitting in a comfortable, air-conditioned capsule, watching the world drift by at 3,000 feet per second. They were untouchable, and they knew it. But the Soviets were learning, they were adapting, and on one fateful day, the game of cat and mouse would change. The untouchable Blackbird would find itself in a trap. The physics that protected it would be tested against a desperate enemy who had finally figured out where the ghost would be. The American pilot, confident in his machine's invincibility, was about to fly into a wall of steel. The doom that the title promised was not a failure of the machine, but a failure of the assumption that they were alone in the stratosphere. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation, a clash between American ingenuity and Soviet brute force, and the outcome would hang on a split-second decision made at 3 times the speed of sound. The mystery did not end with a bang, but with a photograph. It was 1981. The paranoia within the Kremlin had reached a fever pitch. But then, the KGB successfully acquired a manual. It wasn't stolen from a safe in the Pentagon. It was pieced together from open-source aviation journals in the West, combined with grainy satellite imagery and the interrogation of a loose-lipped defense contractor in a bar in West Berlin. The photo landed on General Kirsanov's desk. It showed the aircraft on the tarmac at a British airbase. It was undeniable. "It is not a bomber," the intelligence officer admitted, his voice quiet. "It is a surveillance platform. They call it the SR-71, the Blackbird." Kirsanov stared at the image. The sleek lines, the massive engines, the black paint designed to dissipate heat and absorb radar waves. It was a masterpiece. And it was unarmed. The realization was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the immediate threat of a nuclear first strike from this specific platform was gone. But the humiliation was worse. The Americans were not flying over the Soviet Union to destroy it. They were flying over it to watch it. They were treating the USSR like a zoo. "They are laughing at us," Kirsanov growled. "They build a plane that costs more than our entire naval budget, just to take pictures." The shock was not that the enemy was strong. The shock was that the enemy was arrogant. The existence of the SR-71 was a statement that the United States believed it had conquered the laws of physics that still bound the Soviet Union. But the Soviets had an answer. They had finally built a countermove. Enter the MiG-31 Foxhound aircraft. Unlike the crude MiG-25, which was a sledgehammer, the Foxhound was a sniper rifle. It was equipped with the Zaslon phased array radar, a piece of technology so powerful it could look down into the ground clutter and track a cruise missile, or look up into the stratosphere and lock onto a ghost. It carried the R-33 missiles weapons designed specifically to kill the Blackbird. The trap was set. The date was late 1986. The location, the edge of the Siberian frontier, near the Kamchatka Peninsula. The Americans were running a peripheral reconnaissance mission. The SR-71, call sign Python 41, was skirting the international airspace boundary. The pilot, Major Thomas Stormy B., was relaxed. He had flown this route a dozen times. He knew the drill. He would fly fast, tease the edges of the radar coverage, light up the Soviet defense network, record their electronic screams, and then turn for home. But today, the Soviets were not screaming. They were waiting. 6 MiG-31 Foxhound interceptors were already in the air. They were flying in a wolf pack formation, their radars linked by a data link system that was years ahead of its time. They were running silent, no active radar, guided by ground control. "Target is approaching sector," the ground controller said. "Speed Mach 3.1, altitude 24,000 meters. Lead pilot Captain Mikhail Miyagi watched his passive infrared sensor. He saw the heat bloom before he saw the radar return. The SR-71 was so hot from air friction that it shone like a star in the infrared spectrum. "I see him," Miyagi whispered. "I have the lock." This was the moment. For decades, the Soviets had been helpless. Now, they had the firing solution. The launch light on Miyagi's dashboard flickered yellow. He thumbed the safety cover off the trigger. But at that exact second, 30,000 feet above him, the doom scenario began. Inside the SR-71, the laws of aerodynamics snapped. The SR-71's engines relied on a precise shockwave positioned inside the inlet. If that shockwave was disturbed by a sudden change in air pressure, a maneuver, or a computer glitch, the engine would suffer an unstart. It is a violent, catastrophic event. The shockwave is expelled from the front of the engine. The engine instantly loses 80% of its thrust. The airflow reverses. To the pilot, it feels like hitting a brick wall at 2,000 miles per hour. Bang! The Blackbird yawed violently to the right. The pilot's helmet smashed against the canopy glass. The aircraft groaned, the titanium frame twisting under the insane torque. The right engine had unstarted. The plane was now a glider with one engine pushing it into a flat spin. Major Stormy wrestled with the stick, his vision blurring from the sudden G-forces. The master caution light screamed red. The aircraft began to drop. From the cockpit of the MiG-31 below, Captain Miyagi saw the impossible. The Black Ghost, the invulnerable demon, suddenly vented a cloud of black smoke. It jerked sideways. It began to fall from the sky. "Target is hit!" Miyagi shouted, his heart hammering. "Target is losing altitude! Did someone fire?" "Negative, no launch," the other pilots reported. "It is breaking up," Miyagi said. He watched the blip on his radar descend rapidly. 23,000 meters, 22,000. The speed dropped. Mach 2.8, Mach 2.5. The Soviet pilots watched in stunned silence. The arrogance of the Americans was failing before their eyes. The machine was tearing itself apart. They didn't need to fire. Gravity was doing the work. They were about to witness the crash of the century. They would recover the wreckage. They would have the technology. But inside the falling Blackbird, the American pilot was not dead. He was fighting. "Manual restart?" he shouted to his RSO, Reconnaissance Systems Officer, in the back seat. He cut the fuel to the dead engine. He leveled the wings, fighting the drag. He nosed the plane down further, trading altitude for air pressure, trying to force air back into the screaming turbine. He hit the restart toggle. The chemical ignition shot the triethylborane into the combustion chamber. Whump! Green fire shot out the back of the right engine. The J-58 roared back to life. Miyagi, watching the doomed plane fall, saw the afterburners ignite. He expected the plane to limp away, crippled. Instead, he saw a demonstration of raw, brute power that defied belief. The SR-71 didn't just recover, it lunged. With both engines lit, the pilot pulled the stick back. The Blackbird ceased its fall. It accelerated. It went from Mach 2.5 back to Mach 3 in seconds. It climbed. It soared back up to 26,000 meters as if gravity were a mere suggestion. Miyagi's hand hovered over the missile trigger. He had the lock again. But the computer gave him the probability of kill calculation. It dropped. 50%, 20%, 0%. The SR-71 was accelerating away from him at a speed that made his MiG-31 look like it was parked in the sky. The American pilot, having just survived a near-fatal structural failure, had the audacity to push the throttles to the stops. "He is leaving," Miyagi said, his voice flat. "He is gone." The Foxhounds pushed their engines to the limit, but the gap widened. 10 kilometers. 20. 50. The doomed aircraft had not only survived, it had escaped the trap, suffered a catastrophic failure, fixed it in mid-air, and then outran the fastest interceptors in the Soviet arsenal. Back at the base, Miyagi climbed out of his cockpit. He looked at his ground crew. He looked at the missile still hanging on his wings. "We cannot catch them," he told his commander. "Even when they break, they are faster than us." The shock wasn't the speed. The shock was the resilience. The Soviets realized that the SR-71 wasn't just a fast plane. It was a system designed to survive the environment that the Soviets were afraid to even enter. The confrontation was over. The Soviets had their best radar, their best missiles, and their best pilots in the perfect position. And the American pilot had simply stepped on the gas and walked away. The verdict of history is rarely written in ink. In the Cold War, it was written in aluminum, titanium, and the contrails of missed opportunities. When the dust settled on the frozen runways of Siberia, and the heat signature of the SR-71 Blackbird aircraft faded into the blackness of the upper atmosphere, the Soviet military was left with a terrifying realization. They had not just failed to shoot down a plane, they had failed to shoot down an idea. The numbers tell the story with a brutality that no propaganda can hide. Over the course of its operational life, spanning 3 decades, the SR-71 Blackbird aircraft flew thousands of missions over hostile territory. It flew over Vietnam, North Korea, the Middle East, and the periphery of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, along with their proxies, fired approximately 4,000 surface-to-air missiles at the Blackbird. 4,000 missiles. The number of hits was 0. Not a single SR-71 aircraft was ever lost to enemy fire. Not one pilot was captured. Not one piece of American titanium was paraded through Red Square as a trophy. This statistic, 4,000 to 0, is perhaps the most lopsided score in the history of aerial warfare. It represents a level of dominance that is almost incomprehensible. It means that for 30 years, the United States operated a vehicle that was effectively immune to the best technology the opposing superpower could produce. But the true impact of the Blackbird went far beyond the tactical embarrassment of missed missiles. It was a weapon of economic warfare. The existence of the SR-71 forced the Soviet Union to spend billions of rubles they did not have. To counter this one aircraft, the Soviets had to redesign their entire air defense network. They had to build the MiG-25 aircraft, which ate up massive industrial resources. When that failed, they had to build the MiG-31 Foxhound aircraft and the massive SA-10 and SA-12 missile systems. They built radars so powerful they disrupted television signals in local cities. They kept thousands of pilots on 24-hour alert, burning fuel and wearing out engines. The United States spent money to build a scalpel. The Soviet Union bankrupted itself trying to build a heavy shield to stop it. This was the genius of the American strategy. The Blackbird did not need to drop bombs to destroy the Soviet Union. It simply had to fly. Its mere existence acted as a vacuum, sucking the financial lifeblood out of the Kremlin. It was a technological tax that the Soviet economy, already groaning under the weight of inefficiency, could not afford to pay. And the irony of the materials remained the ultimate punchline. Every time an SR-71 accelerated to Mach 3, the heat expanding its titanium skin, it was a reminder of the Soviet system's failure. The metal had been mined from Soviet Earth, sold by Soviet bureaucrats, and used to build the American ghost that haunted Soviet skies. It was a perfect metaphor for the collapse of the USSR, a system that cannibalized its own resources to feed a rival it could not understand. In the end, the SR-71 was not defeated by a missile. It was defeated by a line item in a budget. By the 1990s, the Cold War was ending. The Soviet Union had dissolved into 15 separate republics. The Berlin Wall was a pile of souvenir rocks. The strategic need for a Mach 3 spy plane began to wane as spy satellites became more advanced and less expensive to operate. The Blackbird was retired. It landed for the last time not in a ball of fire, but in a museum. Today, if you walk into the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Virginia, you can see it. It sits silently in the hangar, its midnight blue paint still looking wet under the floodlights. It looks fast even when it is standing still. It is a relic of a time when engineers used slide rules to challenge the gods. It is a testament to the men like Kelly Johnson, who didn't know that impossible was a stopping point. But for the old Soviet radar operators, the men who sat in the freezing bunkers of Kamchatka and Murmansk, the memory is different. They are old men now. They live in apartment blocks in Moscow, Kiev, and St. Petersburg. But sometimes, on a quiet winter night, they might remember the green glow of the scope. They might remember the fear in the shift commander's voice. They remember the ghost. They remember the blip that moved faster than sound, the target that refused to die, and the sinking feeling in their chests when they realized that no matter how many missiles they fired, the future was simply too fast to catch. The SR-71 Blackbird aircraft remains the only aircraft in history to have never been shot down while serving in a hostile environment for so long. It stands as the ultimate symbol of American Cold War dominance, a machine made of enemy soil that flew untouched above the enemy's head, proving once and for all that in the race for the sky, there was the Blackbird, and then there was everything else. The mystery was never about what the object was. The mystery was how a nation could reach so high, only to find that the Americans were already there, looking down.